For our video today, we are going to look at functions. Now, let's start by talking about what is a function. In math, a function is something that changes a number and gives you an output. So let's think of our function as a box. Okay? We put something into the box. Let's say 5. We get something out of the box. Let's say 6. And the function is what happens inside of the box to change our 5 to a 6. So there is basically a pattern happening, and we have to figure out the rule to that pattern, or just, if we already know the pattern or the rule, follow it for our different inputs to see what our outputs become. So here I said we input 5 and we output 6. Well, what do you think the pattern or the rule for this function is? Well, more than likely it's plus 1. If I were to put in a second number, let's say I put in 12 and I got out 13, then we would definitely know for a fact our function is adding 1. Now this is just a simple explanation of functions. It's kind of like a little mathematical machine where something goes in, something comes out, but they're not going to look like this when you're doing them on your homework or in more advanced math classes. Here's what a function will look like to start off with. This is a function, or can be seen as a function at least. Now what do you notice about it? Hopefully, first thing you notice is we have two variables. We have x and we have y. One of these variables is known as our independent variable. Let me write that in for us. Independent. And the other one is known as our dependent. In our example here, our independent variable is the variable that we are inputting, and it's the one that we have the most control over. So the independent variable for this one is x. Our dependent variable gets its name because it depends on the other variable. Whatever we put in for x, we add 2 to it, and then we end up with y. So our dependent variable is y. Another way to think of it is this is the input, this is the output. And I used x and y here, but you don't have to. It could be any letters. The main thing with a function, though, is that we're going to have two variables. One that we are inputting and one that we are outputting. So, now that we know that, let's take a look at this function. Let me erase this real quick. This function says y equals x plus 2. So whatever value for x we have, we add 2 to it, and that gives us our output of y. And the easiest way to keep track of all of this is to create a little chart. So we make a little table off to the side for x and y, and now we can just input different values for x, follow our rule, and get an output. So think about it. If I take 0 and I substitute it in for x, well, that's going to give me the equation then, y equals 0 plus 2. And what is 0 plus 2? It's just 2. So when x is 0, our function outputs 2. Well, what if I change it? Oops, let me erase that. I'm not inputting 0 this time, I input 1. Well, based on our function, 1 plus 2 gets me 3. And so forth and so on. If my input was 2, my output would be 4. Input of 3, our output is 5. And input of 4, our output would be 6. So our functions kind of just function like a pattern. You're putting something in, you're changing it by whatever the rule is, and you're getting something out. Now, in case you're curious as to why I have it written like this with the equal sign on this side of the equation, it's all personal preference. It really doesn't make a difference. I will tell you that a lot of mathematicians write it this way, but if you were to flip it around, it wouldn't make much of a difference. Let's try a different one. For this function, we are saying that our input of b is being multiplied by 5, and whatever that result is, we get an output of a. So I've already come up with some of our inputs over here. Sometimes you're given the inputs you want to use, sometimes you're asked to create your own, but let's take a look and see. So if I input 2 for b, if I input 2, well, 5 times 2 gets me 10. If I input 5 for b, 5 times 5 gets me 25. If you're thinking to yourself, wow, all I have to do is take the number over here, multiply it by 5, and I get my answer, you'd be absolutely correct. That's all we're doing. We are just working on substituting in our inputs, applying the rule of the function, and getting our outputs. So if I were to continue, well, next one will be 7, so 5 times 7 gets me 35. 5 times 9 gets me 45. And then lastly, if I were to use 16 as my input, 5 times 16 gets me 80. That's all there is to it. Functions are just following a pattern or a rule where you take an input, apply that pattern or rule, and record your output. Hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, make sure you subscribe so you can be up to date with all of my latest videos as they are uploaded. Hope this helps, and enjoy.